Welcome to the Math Functions lecture. In this session, we'll be talking about basically just the objectives and what we hope to cover, a little bit about the math functions themselves. And so let's dive in. What are our objectives? They are to become familiar with the capabilities of DSSVue to perform time series operations. Now, you will hear us call this in the workshop. You'll hear us call this time series functions or time series operations, because the math functions has primarily to do with time series, not exclusively, but primarily. And so we'll be looking at these operations: generation of new time series, modification of existing time series, and then analysis of existing time series. And the math functions within HEC-DSSVue allows you to do all of these things. What else does it also allow? It allows operations, or it provides, I should say, operations in the following categories. And we will look at each of these categories in a future session. We're not going to cover them in this session. What we're going to do now is look at the math functions dialog first, and then we'll get into these. Again, those are all in future sessions. But let's look at the categories. There's arithmetic, just stuff like multiplication, division of time series by a constant or by another time series type things. We have a general category, time functions, hydrologic, smoothing, and statistics. And in each of these categories has multiple operations within that category. And again, we will cover those in lectures coming up. So what do we want to look at now? Let's look at what we really are doing with the math functions dialog, which we will cover in the next session. We'll look at the dialog next, and then we'll get into the usage of it for all these different operations that we just talked about in the different categories. So most math functions generate new data sets, and hopefully by now you know what we mean by a data set. We're talking about a time series that may be a portion of a record or may span multiple records. In other words, the D part of the time series path name is kind of irrelevant because we have a time window set, or the data set could be a single time series record, but it need not be. And so when we talk about data sets, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the records represented by path names, but where the D part doesn't necessarily specify the entire data set extents. And so you're familiar with the parts of the path name, and the F part is the one that has kind of the version. And so when the math functions facility of HEC-DSSVue generates a new data set, it modifies the F part of the data set that it was working from, the primary data set it was working from, and it inserts modified dash before whatever else was in the F part. Now, when we talk about this in future sessions, we'll call this modified data set, we'll call it the computed data set. And so that's what that is. Now, when we use the math functions dialog to generate a computed data set, generate this new data set, it exists only within the math functions dialog. It does not exist in DSS in the file, in the HEC-DSS file yet. And so while we have the math functions dialog up, we can work with the existing data sets along with the computed data set, and we can plot them together, we can tabulate them, we can compare them to different things. We can go on to do future operations. However, if we want that computed data set stored to DSS, we must hit either save or save as from the toolbar or the menu bar. If we say save, it will generate it back to the DSS file as the path name exists with the modified dash, before the F part of the original data set name. If, however, that's not the name we want, we can select save as, and that will bring up a dialog that we can name all the parts that are all the nameable parts. We can't rename the interval or anything like that. But we can rename the parts that are renameable and then save it as that path name. So that's the primary way that we'll work with math functions through in the workshop coming up, and that's how we'll talk about it in this lecture. There is one tab, and it'll be the last one that we cover. The statistics tab in the math functions dialog doesn't generate new data sets. Instead, it provides ways to analyze existing data sets, and that might make sense to you since it's a statistics tab. We're performing statistical analyses of existing data sets. So that's it for this introduction. Next session in this video series, we will get into the operation of how the math functions dialog actually works.